Today on our show, we try to navigate the waters of higher education with Dr. Michael Naughton, the Director of Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas. Also, our president, Chris Check, has another Catholic author to recommend, and so much more, so stay right there. Okay, so you as well, Dr. Naughton, you have youngins at university level.
I do.
You're a father of five.
Father of five.
And but you see it every day. The students come in, and I should tell you this. When we put out the offer to pray for folks, the most common thing that comes back is, my children are not practicing the faith. Could you please pray for my children? It's often associated with their time away at university. What are you people doing over there?
Well, there's a good way to get introduced to the kind of question. Well, we know, right, the data out there is not pleasant.
Yeah, right.
We're living in an increasingly secular culture with we often say it's an increasingly diverse culture, but in many respects, it's an increasingly monolithic culture that's attempting to marginalize religious faith. It marginalizes marriage. It marginalizes whole sorts of different types of things. And the university sometimes is one of the worst places for it. I mean, take, for example, all the data that's out there. When students are walking into universities, they're walking into, and again, different universities will have different expressions of this, but they're often walking into a place where 70% of the faculty, tend to be to the left of things. They tend not to take religious faith very seriously. They tend not to take traditional marriage very seriously.
Or they treat these things with disdain.
Exactly. So either they're apathetic to it or they're hostile to it. And so our children are walking into these types of environments, and one has to have a strategy, a kind of navigation, a kind of navigating and tools to help kids move through this. There's no guarantees on this, and there actually could be a way of thinking, I would say three things. I would say, how do I help my children that when they go through college, faith will be a stronger reality in their lives, not, in a sense, lesser? How do I help them navigate through the question of friendships? And how do I make sure that they don't come after 4 years and come back and live in my basement?
Okay.
Right. I want them to have an ability, marketable work, where they can go out and become productive agents in the world. And because, as we know, one of the other kind of challenges in higher education is debt loads.
Right.
And so the debt load is one big problem. And then the debt load, if you don't have a form of work that can actually pay back the debt, is even worse. And the worst still is to increase the debt and not get the degree.
Yes, right.
Which then leaves you in a much more vulnerable situation because people without degrees earn much, much less money. So these are the three things. And we often kind of maybe grab on one and forget the other. But how do you keep all three of them in mind as you're helping kids move through this system?
It strongly suggests that the content of what you just said suggests that my parenting is not over when they leave for college. Even at a Catholic university, I can't entrust them to the university, or
it depends. Even I would say anywhere. But You're exactly right. My wife and I would often kind of kid around. Okay, you're 18, you're done. We had 5 kids under 10. It was kind of enough, and it was a lot of work and things of that sort. But also, all of us know we still got a lot of work. And even when I have a daughter who's 30, she has our first grandchild. And even there we know it's critical to help. This is the whole extended family phenomenon. We often think like nuclear families is the only thing to be dealing with. And that's not a good way of looking at family.
Yeah.
The extended family is what we have to be thinking about. And every stage needs help. But the college stage is a really important because it's such a formative time for our children, and we can't be helicopter parents because that runs into we see enough of that around St. Thomas. And by the way, the helicopter parent tends to fixate on really minute things. You know,
Right.
What you want to do is you're trying to provide counsel, and you're trying to keep that relationship with your kids to help them out. They have to make those decisions themselves, but they need help. They need help in terms of counsel to kind of move forward in those things.
Okay, so this word that you've used, you need to navigate through, and you stress these three things that you want to get through this experience, which is really at least the way you both have described it, and I do think this is correct. Kind of includes an element of assault to it, assault on things like marriage and prayer life and that kind of thing. But you want to get through it, and you want your kid to get through it with their faith intact, having experienced and having ongoing, having formed friendships, I guess is the other way to say it, and be able to get a job. That's what you would say. Come in.
You know, those are the kind of
and that will help you navigate it.
Right. Those are the three quick things. There's always more to those types of things. But I think if you get those three things right, and you're thinking about those three things, you're thinking about it in a much more holistic sense.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking briefly, Tom Wolfe, one of the great American, I wouldn't say great American writer, but one of the American writers that we have, was often highly critical of East Coast, very elite parents who spend so much time to get their kids into college, but spend so little time helping their kids recognize what college is doing to them.
Yeah. Right.
And so a lot of us, and all of us fall into it. You know, I fall into it. I want my kids to get good grades. I want to give them good scores because I want to have them make sure that they have lots of different options. But that's only one small thing of it. We have to recognize that this is a time of their lives that is profoundly influential for the rest of their lives.
Tim Staples, Director of Apologetics and Evangelization here at Catholic Answers. It has become the topic du jour or the movement du jour that there's no longer just men and women, that we've got to have this other idea of gender. Apparently, I'm gathering that the former idea was somehow oppressive, and now we're liberating ourselves from...
Don't you feel oppressed?
I had often felt...
You're limited to just one gender, man.
I know, this binary thing. But okay, so... first of all, what is, in your view, where is all this coming from? What is this transgenderism stuff about? And what's a proper Christian response?
You know, a lot of folks don't realize, because as these things usually go, it starts as a little seed. Planted in a mostly innocuous way, and before long, you've got a massive plant. Where did this come from?
Exactly.
And this is what happened. In the 1860s, it began...
Wait a second. In the 1860s?
Yes.
Okay, all right. All right, no, I didn't know we were going to go back that far. Okay.
In the 1860s, believe it or not, and in fact, the first time in writing was 1892, when in the field of psychology, see, what had happened is in the field, they had rejected natural law. As a principle of morality, which is easy to do. As our Protestant friends have discovered, it's easy to throw off the church. It's more difficult to build something, right?
Yeah.
You know, we're not Catholic anymore, says Luther. Well, now you've got about 40,000 denominations, right? Because when the confusion starts when you have to actually put something together. Well, we threw off natural law. that's Catholic, archaic, medieval stuff, right? Well, what's your principle of morality then? And in the field of psychiatry, they attempted, and I say that the initial attempt was actually noble. They were attempting to distinguish between homosexuals and those who act in accordance with what you and I know is the moral law, right? And so they had to come up with language. Well, what language did they use? This is when heterosexual was created. The term did not exist until the 1860s, first time in writing in 1892. And why is that? Well, heterosexual was a term used to describe the natural affection. Because remember, once you throw off moral law, the natural law, whereby we know that we are ordered, and all of we are ordered, first of all, to know and love God, to be happy in this life and eternally happy with Him in the next life, and all of our acts, all of our human acts and such also have essences. They are directed to particular ends in order for us to ultimately be happy, including the sexual act.
Right.
Right? It has a purpose, which is the union of one man, one woman, procreation of children. Anything, that would purposely distort either one of those ends becomes gravely disordered. Okay, you and I know that. That's natural law. What happens when you remove that? Everything becomes the affection, the affective level, the level of the affective. It's what you feel. So we come up with a term. Heterosexual is the term, the quote-unquote normal, and this is how it started, the normal way a man ought to feel. Toward a woman. That's called the heterosexual impulse. The abnormal way that a man often does feel toward a man is homosexual, right? So it was originally intended to make the distinction between what is normal and what is abnormal, but the bottom line is...
So it's not about what you are, it's about what you feel.
It's about what you feel.
Okay.
That's right. What your tendency is.
Right.
But here's the problem. Why is one better than the other?
Yeah, eventually you're going to get to that question.
Because if you don't have natural law, which is the principle whereby we discern what is right, ordered to nature, and nature's God, and what is wrong, that which is contrary to nature, everything becomes a matter of what you feel. And so why are we saying this is normal and this is not? Well, inevitably, 1892 leads to where we are now. Now, it didn't immediately jump to transgenderism, but what it does is it moves into every area of morality. The homosexual act, which is contrary to nature, becomes totally normal, and you can't say one is better than the other. Folks, if we are reduced to teaching our moral standards by virtue of what we feel, we have absolutely created cultural chaos. Because, if I would not even want people to know some of the things I've been inclined to do over the years. I mean, if I did everything I was inclined to do over the years, I would be in prison right now.
Yeah.
My goodness, folks, we have inclinations that go all over the place due to our fallen state. But once you reduce morality to this level, it becomes well, if I have an impulse to masturbation, well, that's good because it's an impulse. If I have an impulse towards same sex, and the next thing coming down the pike is NAMBLA.
Oh,
right?
please, God,
come
help
on.
us. I know.
Because, hey, I have this inclination, so therefore it's no worse, it's no better. And now we've gone beyond just the role of the sexual, in as much as we're talking about the conjugal act. Now we're talking about, I have an inclination to be a lizard.
Oh, yes, right.
You actually have transspeciesism. You have all sorts of trans, but unfortunately, and I'll punt it back to you here in a second, but unfortunately, this is why I call transgenderism an outrage. People get mad when I say that.
Well, the Pope says the same thing. Everybody who's out there loving Pope Francis.
It is. It's demonic.
That's what he said.
It's an outrage. Why? Because you have these poor children and teens who are confused and trying to make their way. And my goodness, you feel all kind of different impulses here and there. But then you're told by the culture, whatever the impulse is, you just act on it because it's good. It's no worse. It's no better. And so what happens? A kid is going through a terrible situation, may even have deep-rooted psychological, spiritual problems that lend them to a genuine, there is a genuine psychological disorder called, gender dysphoria. I mean, that's a real thing. But unfortunately, rather than extending our hands and trying to help them to understand that, look, biology, and God is the God of biology, by the way. We believe in science as Catholics and as Christians. You are a male. No matter what you feel, you are a male, and you need to learn to act like one. We need to help you in your confusion. What do? Instead of helping them, we encourage them in the delusion to where they start acting like what they are not. This is what I call an outrage.
After that, it's just despair, because there's nothing that can help me. If my feelings determine everything.
And we have, in the last 3 years, every year, an epidemic of suicide.
Yeah.
And they're wondering, why is this happening? Why are we having...
Because you're lying to kids about what they are. That's why it's happening. You're lying to them about what they are.
This is not the only factor, but this is one factor among many.
Yeah.
We have a culture that is spiraling out of control into such confusion that we no longer know what it means to be a human being. Not only have we lost God, I think St. Paul's prophecy has come to pass, prophetic in the sense that he describes the process in Romans 1:21 through 29.
Okay.
Although they knew God, they refused to acknowledge him as God and give thanks to him as God. Professing themselves to be wise, they've become fools. And what did they do? Once they reject the God they know, they begin to worship all manner of four-legged creatures.
Yeah.
And ultimately it devolves into the worship of self, men with men, women with women, and the narcissism that entails really all of it. This is where we are as a culture. And once you reach there, you are at the level of despair. And so, Sai, there has never been a more important time than for you and I to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ in a world that has become so dark. Our country, the United States, has become so dark, and our people are so confused. They are resorting to suicide in numbers we've never seen before. They need Jesus, and they need reality.
Praise God, Tim. Thank you very much. Later we can talk about this, but you really hurt my feelings through a lot of that. My feelings are very hurt now. I wish you would pay more attention to my feelings.
Yes, brother.
Thanks, Tim Staples. Chris Check, president of Catholic Answers, Catholic authors you should read.
Right.
That's what we call your segment now.
I love it.
Catholic authors you should read.
I want to encourage reading.
Yeah, I know, but it's hard because there's so much just looking. Like now you could just look at things. You don't have to read them.
So I recently had the good fortune to contribute a chapter to a book about fatherhood, and it was a personal testimony. It's coming out from Ignatius Press later this year. It was a personal testimony about my own father. And I called the segment, or the chapter, Books and Food, which were two important things in my house.
Yeah.
And they go together because our dinner conversations were almost always about books. And my house was full of them. So I credit my dad for my interest in books.
I'm glad to hear it. You also have a what I consider a freakish memory for books. You remember who wrote them and when they wrote them and all that kind of stuff. And so let's talk a little bit about Paul Horgan.
Paul Horgan is someone that my dad introduced me to when I was in high school. And Horgan was a Catholic writer. And I would put him in this second category of Catholic writers, not so much didactic, but a man with a Catholic with a clear moral imagination, and by the way, a superb prose style.
I'm just going to translate that into English. He's not a Catholic writer writing just for Catholics. He's a Catholic with a Catholic imagination in his writing.
He's not teachy. He's not necessarily talking about Catholic themes. He's talking about human themes from a Catholic perspective.
Okay.
Right? Like Green or Waugh or Walker Percy or Flannery O'Connor. And this is a spectrum. Right. So anyway, Paul Horgan, born in upstate New York, but when he was 12 years old, I think his family moved to Albuquerque. So he fell in love with the high Southwest. So he is kind of a regional writer too, which I think is maybe part of the reason that he's not better known than he is. Although he did win 2 Pulitzer Prizes.
Who hasn't? Who hasn't won 2 Pulitzer Prizes?
One is he had 2 magnum opuses. 2 magnum opuses. Opie. One was for a history he did of the Rio Grande, of the river.
Yeah.
And it's a natural and a social or political history of the Rio Grande. It's absolutely magnificent. He got the Pulitzer Prize for it. The other Pulitzer Prize that he won was for L'Ami of Santa Fe.
Right.
Now, anyone who has read Willa Cather's Death Comes to the Archbishop knows Archbishop L'Ami as Archbishop Latour. That's
the same guy.
Fictionally represented in Death Comes to the Archbishop. But Horgan is an historian on the scale, on the quality of a Herodotus or a Livy or even a Gibbon. Now, and what do I mean by this? I know that people can say Edward Gibbon, he was very anti-Catholic. He was. But these guys, Herodotus, Livy, Gibbon especially, these were great narrative historians.
Oh, right.
So you're not going to find a ton of footnotes and this sort of thing,
Right.
and you will get conversations. This kind of history bothers some purists, I guess, but it's the kind of history I like to read.
Yeah.
David McCulloch.
It's the kind of history normal people like to read, instead of this scientific history.
Right, with a ton of footnotes and whatnot. David McCulloch, the guy who writes all the American histories, he wrote 1776.
Right.
He is a huge Paul Horgan fan.
Yeah. You can see it. I had never thought about that. You can see it in the way he tells history.
That narrative history. So, first book I recommend by Paul Horgan is Lemmy of Santa Fe. Now, this is an obviously Catholic work about a great man who re-evangelized the Southwest after the Spanish Franciscans left.
Okay.
Right, and a superb story. And it looks thick, but you'll fly through it. The book that I really want to recommend to everybody this summer for their summer reading is called A Distant Trumpet. And A Distant Trumpet.
Now, this is fiction.
It is fiction.
Okay, so that's not one of the history books.
Correct. And A Distant Trumpet also takes place in the high Southwest in the period following the war between the states. And it is the story of a young cavalry officer and out there on the Indian frontier. And oddly enough, I came across a quote by George Weigel, who I later found out is a big Paul Horgan fan. I had no idea. And he said he compliments Horgan for his moral imagination, for his ability to represent characters whose moral problems we identify with, moral challenges with which we identify. But he says it is a beautiful book about heroism, marriage, and it is about marriage and all the parts. I mean, the joys and the challenges thereof of true Christian marriage, and also, and I really give Weigel credit for this, a mature patriotism, because. Because the protagonist in the book, the young cavalry officer, he finds himself eventually at odds with his country's policies in the treatment of the Indians on the frontier. So he has this conflict. He's not a jingo, right? But he is a patriot, but he runs afoul of his country's political policies with respect to the treatment of Indians on the frontier. It is a magnificent story. Every 15-year-old boy should read it.
Hand it over.
A Distant Trumpet.
This is my copy now. A Distant Trumpet.
Yeah.
All right, from Paul Horgan.
Paul Horgan. One more.
Okay,
the best coming of age ever written, a Catholic coming of age story. Things as They Are. It's the first of the Richard trilogy, and some of these are slightly autobiographical.
Yep.
He wrote over 40 books, essays.
And only 2 Pulitzer Prizes.
Yeah.
Get it together, Paul Horgan.
A great Catholic writer.
Thanks very much, Chris Check, President of Catholic Answers.
My pleasure.
So my question is this. I've looked at modern developed countries, like Canada, Europe, Oceania, and they used to be very devout Christian countries. They used to have a lot of Christian traditions and beliefs and whatnot. And over the course of years, especially, Scandinavia too, used to be predominantly Protestant, and there have been predominantly Catholic countries, but over the course of many years, they've become increasingly irreligious and even atheistic. We're not seeing so much of that in third world countries or even as fast a pace in the United States, but why is that the case in developed nations?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think one factor, and of course the human person is a mystery, very complex, so these issues are always very complex, but one thing that jumps out at me is the gospel we just read this past Sunday, Luke chapter 6, St. Luke's version of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor. Matthew, in Matthew 5, of course, says, blessed are the poor in spirit. St. Luke, blessed are the poor. Are those contradictions, Si? No, they're not, but I believe he said both. It's amazing, when folks see these things like that. Oh, it's a contradiction. Si, I think, how many times have I given my conversion story?
Yeah, right.
To think that Jesus only gave the Sermon on the Mount, that information one time, of course not. He probably did it many, many times, and St. Luke records a little bit different. But I think, to get to your question, Ryan, blessed are the poor and poor in the spirit are very much related, because the poor tend to understand. It's not that, all the poor are going to heaven and all the rich are going to hell. Of course not. But there is a tendency among the poor I have seen as I travel this world, my friend. I've seen the poorest of the poor in Mexico and in the Philippines and painfully in India. And you find that poor people know. They have a huge advantage over the fat cats in the Western world that are rich, and that is they know they need. They are in need. And until we understand that, we are of all men most miserable. Because when we think, as Jesus said of the man, remember, who says, boy, I'm successful, I am wealthy. I think I'm going to build some bigger barns to put more of my stuff in it. I'm so wealthy. And he says, thou fool, thou didst not know your soul would be required of thee that very night. And that person ends up in hell. You know, so there is a sense in which the poor are blessed in that regard. Doesn't mean, yeah, I want everybody to be poor. Sigh, give me all your money so you can be poor and then you'll get to heaven. No, of course not. We minister to the poor, but that's simply a fact. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, powerful text of Scripture that says, especially verse 12 there, if any man think he stand, take heed lest he fall. The worst place a man can be is to think he's arrived, is to think, man, I got it. I am here, baby. I don't need nothing. I don't need nobody. You are absolutely impoverished. This is why Mother Teresa, she didn't say that cliche. She says she's been around the world and seen the poorest of the poor. She's never seen such poverty as she went to New York City. And, you know, in major cities. And I think she was speaking specifically about New York City, but Washington, D.C. and the major cities. And why is that? Because folks can have all kind of money, but inside they're absolutely empty and poor. So, again, Ryan, I mean, it's a very complex issue because there's been a lot of philosophical, you know, with the so-called Enlightenment, the rejection of God, the Reformation, in fact, I put in there as a huge factor in casting off authority, and then the Enlightenment and the philosophy that puts man in the center instead of God. All of these things are factors that have led to this dark place that we are, and we are in a very dark place culturally, to where on a scale we've really never seen in the history of the world. We have pornography, we have, you know, the homosexuality, you know, one of the sins that cries out to God for vengeance. And in our culture, you're not even allowed to say that. Hey, I just said it, though, didn't I, Si?
Indeed you did.
I think I'm in trouble. And you know what? I don't care, because we're perishing in our culture. We have people walking all around with suits and ties on, and they're dying inside because every kind of immoral lifestyle is being exalted now as normal. I believe this is all a result of the various philosophies and religions that have pushed God further and further back until now. God is dead. Philosophy is dead.
Yeah.
Right? And what is left? The misery that we see.
Thanks for watching Catholic Answers Live TV. Join us each weekday from 3 to 5 Pacific and 6 to 8 Eastern for our live radio broadcast on EWTN Radio. Or join us on the EWTN app. Find more videos and live streams on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/CatholicCom. Or find us on Facebook simply by searching Catholic Answers. Jesus Christ is the light of the nations, and we'll see you next week on Catholic Answers Live TV.